Hi and welcome to my channel. This episode is all about exposure. I'm in the garden, I'm under an umbrella, and it looks to be about f5.6. How do I know? I'm using a Mark 1 eyeball. Stick with me to find out how to do that. For the average experienced photographer, getting the right exposure is a small, mildly painful bit that you do before getting creative with subject and composition. A necessary little evil, if you like. For the beginner, it can seem like a huge and confusing mountain of information with lots of conflicting info online. I'm going to try and make exposure as simple as possible, to try and teach it to you the way the subject was taught to me by my dad. Firstly, it's important to know why we have different speeds or sensitivities of film. If you know anything about digital photography, you'll know that we treat ISO or ISO like a sort of volume control. We turn up the gain of the sensor when lighting's not good, when there's not a lot of light about. We turn up the gain to a higher ISO number, and essentially there's a degradation of the image a bit, but the whole thing becomes more sensitive and you can take pictures in lower light. Likewise, when there's a lot of light about, you turn down the ISO and you get a finer quality of image. It's exactly the same with film, except the ISO is baked into the material you're using. So your film may be an ISO 100 or ISO 400 or ISO 800 even. So a slow film of say ISO 25 to ISO 80 is great when there's plenty of light about. You can shoot high quality images with no issues. When the light drops, however, there is an issue. You may end up having to expose the film to that dimmer light for far longer to get an image. In other words, use a slow shutter speed. And then either the camera or the subject can move during the exposure and you'll wind up with blurred pictures. So for our first photo walk out together, we're going to treat our camera like a box camera and just use one shutter speed. We're going to keep things really simple. The shutter speed range you'll find on your camera will look a bit like this. The numbers are fractions of a second apart from 1, which is 1 second. So the fastest is 1/1000th of a second, the next fastest is 1/500th of a second, and the next fastest is 1/250th of a second, etc. Each time the number halves, it doubles the amount of light the film gets. So say 1/4 of a second gives twice as much light as 1/8 of a second. So let's assume we're going to load up with 100 ISO film. We're going to set our shutter speed to the closest number we can to that ISO or ISO. And that will be 125th of a second. There's what might turn out to be an urban legend that the great street photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson actually only used 125th of a second when he could get away with it, and simply did what we're going to do, which is to vary the exposure by varying the aperture. This, of course, would have helped him to be fast off the mark for his decisive moment photographs. At this point, I'd better introduce you to the aperture scale. The numbers are actually a bit odd, and that's because historically they refer to the actual diameter of the hole in the iris diaphragm that creates the aperture. The scale is f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11 and f16. There are numbers that continue this scale in each direction, but those are the commonest that you'll find on most lenses. The biggest hole to let light in is f2 on this part of the scale, and the smallest is f16. Just as with the shutter speed scale, going a number in either direction either halves or doubles the exposure. So f2 lets in twice as much light as f2.8, f2.8 lets in twice as much light as f4, etc., etc., down the scale. I'll quickly show you a neat trick. You can line the scales up, just like they are around the lens on my Mamiya Professional medium format camera. And here you see 125th at f8 set, but all the other number pairs that are opposite each other are giving the same amount of light to the film. As you are halving one scale, you double the other, so the light coming in remains the same. Unfortunately, the number of cameras that have shutter speed, selector rings and aperture rings next door to each other are quite small. It tends to be professional cameras like Hasselblad's and Mamiya's. However, we can use this principle quite easily, and we will do when we want to actually vary the shutter speed and aperture together. But what we need to do first is use our one shutter speed and find an aperture for it. We're going to use what is commonly called the sunny 16 rule. This simply means on a bright sunny day with no clouds, there's f16's worth of light about. Simple as that. If it's bright, but with the sun covered by light cloud, then it's going to be an f11 sort of day. If it's a bit more grey and overcast, it'll be an f8 day. And if it's really dull and brooding, then it'll be an f5.6 day. And if you put your subject in shadow, in the shade of a building for example, it'll be f4. Now we could get pretty accurate exposure simply by setting, if we've got a nice sunny day, 100th of a second at f16 with our 100 ISO film. Of course, it won't take long in your progression in photography to realise that you don't always want to use that aperture, that one aperture, for the sort of day it is or the sort of light that's about. You may want to vary that because you might actually want to use a higher shutter speed to stop fast movement, for example, or you might want to use a wide aperture so that you can throw background out of focus. All of this I'm going to come on to in my creative use of shutter speeds and apertures episode. But for the moment, you can be quite confident at walking out with a camera with no meter whatsoever and just use your eyes to work out how much light there is. As an aside, that's actually what's known as incident light measurement, measuring the amount of light that's going to fall onto your subject. The other form of light measurement, which pretty much all cameras with built-in metering use, is the amount of light reflected by the subject. Of course, some subjects are far more reflective than others, so in many cases, incident light measurement, even if it is by trusty old sunny 16 rule, can be more accurate than using a reflected light meter and not interpreting it properly. So to sum up, we're going to set our camera shutter speed to the closest number we can to our film speed. If it's a 400 ISO film, for example, we'll set it at a 500th of a second. If it's a 200 ISO film, we'll set it at a 250th of a second, etc., etc. We'll then set our aperture according to the sunny 16 rule and just get on and shoot and not worry. You'll be in good company. There were whole generations of Edwardian and Victorian photographers who made do with exposure charts that were published in the back of photographic almanacs. And in fact, inside every film packet, back when I was learning photography, if you opened the packet out and laid it flat, you would find a sunny 16 table all ready for you to use. I really don't know why they stopped doing that. So, that should give you some tools to work with to determine your exposure in pretty much any situation. I'll go on to working with light meters, but that should give you somewhere to start. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, go on and hit that like button. And If you want to see some more, think about subscribing. For the time being, I'll catch you in the next video. Take care of yourselves and keep taking pictures.